Good evening, and on a very beautiful day for me in Marrakech, cloudy, the harshness of the sun gone, gentle drizzle, adding to the beautiful, what I may call a pink landscape which I see in Marrakech with all the tall palms, actually finishing the picture that I had, mind picture that I had of Marrakech. Although I've been to Morocco twice before, I've not come to Marrakech. So this is my first visit, and it's such a beautiful place. It leaves a lasting impression in your mind, and I'll certainly fondly carry that back home. But before I start, I would want to share a moment in condoling the deaths and also the property lost because of the earthquake. Quietly and resolutely, Morocco's worked to have rescue and rehabilitation done. And all of us were happy when we got to know that the World Bank IMF meeting will still be held here, because initially we had a bit of a doubt whether the government would want to hold it here or not. But when you decided to have it here, and against all odds, it was such a wonderfully organized event with the signature hospitality of Morocco in full show. So thank you very much for that, and my expressed condolences on the tragedy that you had to face, but I'm sure you're coming out of it in a very steady and with good grit. We are in support. I think the Prime Minister of India did announce as soon as he heard about this that India would be happy to participate as and when Morocco finds it necessary and fit. So we stand by Morocco. But today we are assembled here in the context or the immediate background of the IMF and World Bank meeting, and also the last of the finance ministers and central bank governors meet under India's presidency. We were happy to have a communique come out. We were happy to have consensus on very many issues. And I was just standing here and talking with the organizers, with the CII, as to why it is so very important that we really take this consensus and consensus-driven communique issued in the G20 seriously. Many of what we want to talk today are going to be of great relevance for next couple of generations. May not be exactly comparable, but I would still place it post the Second World War, when the Bretton Woods institutions were established. The kind of consensus, coherence, cooperation with which the entire world looked at setting up of these institutions as a prerequisite for any revival post the war. And those institutions have stood by us for nearly 70, 80 years, but gradually now showing signs of fatigue. And because of that, many of the objectives which were to be served, other than restoring Europe after the war, are still waiting to be served. But many other institutions have come besides the Bretton Woods. But today we are at a juncture where post-COVID, post a very fragmented multipolar world, these very institutions now will have to be revived to meet with the current challenges, the challenges of 21st century, where if I were to confine myself talking only about the multilateral development banks, I can say that the best practices and the business model of the 19th century or 20th century was what governed the Bretton Woods institutions all the while. But today you see private banks or corporate sector itself going on a different business formulation and are lots more nimble in dealing with finances, raising resources, handling their objectives speedily and in a lot more efficient way. And therefore, India's presidency in the G20, before I say that, one other feature was most of the post-Second World War institutions, global institutions, were fashioned after most European powers or the United States of America, with very little, if I may say, very little contribution from countries which had just come out of colonial rule. So obviously Africa was not heard, Asia, many of them didn't have any say. But today's environment, the engine of growth actually lies with the emerging market economies, the developing economies. Resources which are so required for 21st century are all lying untapped in the African and Latin American continents. So now when you speak of the voice of the South, which is what Honorable Prime Minister of India did as soon as he took over the charge of G20 presidency, is to say that he shall make sure India's presidency will be the voice of the South. It's not just going to be India being part of the G20, but it shall reflect the aspirations and also the needs of the global South. Lucky that we had in the troika of the G20, Indonesia before us, and now Brazil after us. Post that, it's going to be South Africa. So you have a continuous 3-4 years with the emerging markets showing the leadership in the G20. So with all this, today for the CII, the panelists are certainly going to be talking on reviving growth with inclusivity. And for that, galvanizing private capital to support governments and multilateral institutions. Very much synchronizes with the recommendations of the international expert group, the co-chair, co-convener, N.K. Singh is with us here, so he is going to give you the rich content of what is in the IEG. But I'll go to talk about this theme which has been talked and deliberated upon in the G20. The resilience of the global economy today is being tested in the face of multiple headwinds, which are amplifying the challenge of maintaining growth with inclusivity. However, as nations try to steer their respective economies and brace for an uncertain future, India stands out as a beacon of hope, resilience for the world. Amidst this backdrop, I am pleased to speak to you after the recently concluded G20 summit, where the world under India's historic presidency came together as one and unanimously adopted the Delhi Declaration. Inclusivity and consensus building have been a cornerstone of India's efforts during the presidency, reaffirmed across multiple domains. This approach is aptly captured in India's G20 theme of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, which we have conveniently translated to mean one earth, one family, one future. These 3 words or 6 words actually bring in the theme of sustainability, inclusivity, climate, and taking care of everybody as though because we are part of one large family. So this is the vision of Prime Minister Shri Narendra Modi. He articulated a human-centric approach to reshaping the global economy to be more prosperous, inclusive, and sustainable. Under his leadership, India made impressive strides in creating and leveraging its digital public infrastructure, about which there was a lot of discussion, for advancing financial inclusion and productivity gains. Key aspects of inclusivity and consensus building during India's G20 presidency included admitting the African Union as part of the G20, adoption of the Green Development Pact, commitment to pursue reforms for better, bigger, and more effective multilateral development banks, and convening the attention of member countries to the pressing needs of accelerating the progress of sustainable development goals. The theme of this inaugural session, meeting the SDG financing gaps, how can private capital support public funds, captures an important aspect of the broad recommendations that emanated from the Delhi Declaration regarding the timely pursuit of SDGs. As part of the Delhi Declaration, it was highlighted that at the midway point to 2030, the global progress of SDG is off track, with only close to 12% of the targets on track. Referring to this decade as the decade of action, India, under its presidency, has called upon the G20 members to collectively resolve to fully and effectively implement the 2030 agenda and accelerate progress towards the SDGs in a timely manner. It may be noted that 17 Sustainable Development Goals adopted by the United Member States, that is, been extended to cover financing for SDGs in addition to climate finance. The COVID-19 pandemic widened the annual SDG financing gap in 2020 from an estimated $2.5 trillion to $3.9 trillion in just the developing countries. The challenge of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030 is becoming increasingly difficult and is becoming more costly. Acknowledging this challenge under its presidency, India has sought new instruments for financing sustainable development goals. To bridge the SDG financing gap, especially for the emerging markets and developing economies, there is a need to enhance innovative financing approaches such as blended finance and risk-sharing tools, which could be used to leverage private finance for scaling up sustainable finance. The B20 recommendations, about which we had the president of the CII speak. The B20 recommendation for setting up of a global SDG acceleration fund, which proposes to bring governments, the private sector, and the philanthropies together to bridge the SDG financing gap by leveraging credit enhancement tools and blended finance, is along similar lines and could help bring down the cost of capital for enhancing the financial viability of SDG projects and pool of fundable projects. Private sector capital must complement the efforts of governments and multilateral institutions in pursuit of this global objective, and its contribution can go a long way in advancing the SDGs. Official sources of finance from the MDBs and other development finance institutions to reduce the real and perceived risks associated with projects in emerging markets and developing economies can help mitigate these risks and unlock significantly larger flows. In this endeavor, philanthropic capital can also play a similar role in absorbing risks and lowering costs, thereby helping to mobilize private capital. In 2023, we have focused on social-related SDGs such as health, education, poverty reduction, clean water and sanitation, and mapped them against financial instruments like social impact bonds, SDG-linked bonds, and so on. We have developed recommendations which aim to mobilize private financing for SDGs through greater adoption of these instruments and bonds. We have also compiled a compendium of case studies to build understanding and awareness among G20 members of the current actions being taken to enable financing towards SDGs. The compendium aims to share country experiences and best practices for financing SDGs. Working towards the advancement of SDGs is a global public good. I underline this. Working towards the advancement of SDGs is a global public good. The financing requirements are immense, which calls for a global collaborative effort across stakeholders. Efforts and concrete financing commitments of all, and official, when I say all, official governments, multilateral institutions, development finance institutions, and most importantly, the private sector. The efforts and concrete financing commitments of all is therefore very paramount, and these will have to complement each other for this shared global priority. In financing SDGs, private capital will do well to make sure that such investments are sustainable for countries too, and that means reconciliation of their commercial goals with the creation of public goods. This is a very important diagnostic tool. If you're able to understand that these investments are going towards country public infrastructure creation, then the balance between the commercial interest and the public interest gets worked out well. So in financing SDGs, private capital will do well to make sure that such investments are sustainable for countries too, and that means reconciliation of their commercial goals with the creation of public goods. The pursuit of SDG will have to be a sustainable endeavor in itself. Finally, I'm confident that the MDB's reform process itself, emanating from the G20 deliberations, will also provide a unique opportunity for them to maximize investments into developing countries, including through increased co-investments with the private sector, which can leverage this unique opportunity to increase its footprint in funding the SDGs and join hands with public institutions to meet the SDGs goal by 2030. To conclude, the SDGs provide a shared blueprint for peace and prosperity, for people and the planet, now and also into the future. It is the collective responsibility of all shareholders and for all stakeholders to participate in and contribute to this endeavor. I invite the private sector to come forward and join the pursuit of this global vision. Thank you for having me, and thank you for patiently hearing my thoughts.